Now we come towards the conclusion of Ecclesiastes as the teacher wraps up what he has to say and draws our attention to the value of the experience of joy in life. And there's a lot of confusion that's surrounded the interpretation of what Ecclesiastes is saying here, because some people want to say the teacher is encouraging us to value life because that's all we've got. All we've got is pleasure, and it's all going to slip away anyway. But that fails to understand the greater theological context of Ecclesiastes. He's also not saying that we should enjoy life because ultimately that leads to a kind of final fulfillment in life. Instead, participation in the simple joys of life is receiving with thanks the gifts that God has to give us. Ecclesiastes has taken a remarkable intellectual journey through the course of the book because the teacher has examined the value of wisdom, he's reflected on the certainty of death, he's wrestled with the mystery of God's providence in contradiction to the book of Proverbs. The life doesn't always follow the algorithm that it seems like it's supposed to follow. The teacher has discovered that human beings cannot secure permanence through their own achievements because every life remains subject to time itself. Those conclusions might suggest that the book is moving towards despair, and some people read it that way, but instead Ecclesiastes then speaks with kind of an unexpected serenity towards the end. The teacher has not solved the great mysteries of life. Existence is still a mystery to him, but he's learned how to live faithfully in the presence of that mystery. This shift has often puzzled readers and commentators. The book repeatedly encourages us to enjoy life. Eat your bread with joy, the teacher says. Drink your wine with a merry heart. These exhortations appear throughout Ecclesiastes, and they become more and more prominent as the argument of the letter unfolds. Some interpreters have understood them to be an invitation of pleasure simply because death is going to overtake everyone, so you might as well get what you can before it's gone. But that reading overlooks the theological setting of the book. Joy is never presented as an escape from reality. Instead, it's presented as a recognition that life itself comes from the hand of God as a gift. Tremper Longman argues that passages like these should be understood as gifts of divine grace within a world whose deepest mysteries remain hidden to the explorer. The teacher doesn't claim that human beings have mastered life. He invites us to receive what God has already placed before us. A meal shared with friends, or satisfaction that comes from honest work, or the delight of companionship become occasions of gratitude because they are no longer expected to carry the weight of eternity. They're good precisely because they are gifts rather than possessions. Earlier chapters explored the human desire to secure lasting significance through accomplishment, and the closing chapters describe a person whose attention has shifted away from possession towards reception, towards accepting these as gifts from God. And the difference is a little bit subtle, but it transforms the teacher's vision of a good life. Gratitude grows most naturally in those who recognize that the world cannot be reduced to human control. For that reason, the teacher never presents joy as a distraction from mortality. Death remains an undeniable reality throughout the book, and Ecclesiastes refuse to soften its presence. Every human moves towards the same horizon, and that certainty gives urgency to the present moment. So a meal with a friend becomes precious because it cannot be repeated forever. Friendship itself acquires depth because every relationship belongs to time and will be consumed by time. Labor gains dignity because each day offers opportunities that eventually come to an end. Many scholars have observed that Ecclesiastes anticipates themes that later become central to existential philosophy in the Western tradition in the 20th century, although an important distinction should be made between the two. Thinkers like Martin Heidegger, who was one of the formative thinkers in existential thought, argued that authentic existence requires an honest acknowledgement of death. Ecclesiastes reaches a similar conclusion, but it's through a theological framework that Heidegger was not using. The teacher believes that life possesses value because it has been given by God. Mortality actually fits into the context of gratitude, and it helps gratitude acquire its deepest meaning. If we look to the ministries of Jesus, we see that those strikingly display a similar posture towards ordinary life. The Gospels tell stories about Jesus attending weddings and having meals with friends and being accepted into people's homes. And so table fellowship occupies a remarkable place within his ministry. Meals become moments in which the kingdom of God is anticipated through hospitality and reconciliation and joy. Jesus never treats the ordinary gifts of creation as obstacles to genuine spirituality, like some kind of ascetic monk. They become signs of the Father's generosity. Look at the story of the feeding of the 5,000 that's in all four Gospels. It repeats the pattern. Faced with a hungry crowd, Jesus receives the loaves and the fish with thanksgiving before distributing them to the people. The miracle begins with gratitude. John's Gospel records that Jesus gave thanks before the bread was broken. The abundance that follows in the miracle emerges from the Father's provision rather than from human ingenuity. That scene echoes the vision of Ecclesiastes, where joy grows from receiving life instead of attempting to secure it through anxious striving. This perspective also shapes the way Jesus speaks about anxiety in the Sermon on the Mount. His teaching directs attention towards the birds of the air and the lilies of the field. He says, look at how the birds of the air eat. They don't sow or reap, they don't plant anything, and yet God feeds them. And you're worth more than a sparrow. And look at the lilies of the field and how beautifully they're dressed. They're dressed more beautifully than a king. And if God will dress the lilies of the field that way, imagine how much more he cares for you. These images do more than encourage optimism for us. They invite us to inhabit a creation that depends upon the Father's care. Jesus calls his disciples into a posture of trust that resembles the teacher's mature wisdom in Ecclesiastes. The future may remain hidden, but the goodness of God makes faithful living possible in the present. The final chapters of Ecclesiastes gradually draw us towards old age. Chapter 12 is an interesting one on this one because it contains a poem that's fairly famous and significant in biblical literature. Its imagery has inspired centuries of interpretation. If you go back a long ways, early commentators often treated every detail as a symbolic description of the aging body. The early church commentators had what they would call a spiritual way of reading the scriptures and drew metaphors and analogies and prophecies that were not apparent in the original text. So the Ecclesiastes 12 refers to the grinders, and the early church commentators would say, oh, that has to do with the teeth, and the windows are like eyes, and the strong men are like weakening legs. And there's an impressive history to that kind of interpretation, all the way up really through the Reformation writers, and then it kind of peters away in the modern age. But many contemporary scholars regard the poem as a sustained meditation whose power lies in its atmosphere. Chun-Leong Xiao, who was actually my Hebrew professor at Princeton Seminary, suggested that the language evokes the experience of life's gradual fading rather than providing a series of coded anatomical references. The poem begins with a command that gives shape to everything that follows. Quote, remember your Creator in the days of your youth. Memory carries a richer meaning in the Hebrew scriptures than the modern English word would suggest to us. To remember God involves faithful attention. Israel remembers the covenant through worship. God remembers his people through acts of mercy. The teacher therefore calls his readers to orient the whole of life towards the one from whom life has come. The description that follows possesses remarkable literary restraint. Light slowly diminishes. Strength gives way to frailty. Familiar sounds lose their clarity and movement becomes slower. The imagery unfolds patiently, allowing the reader, you and I, to experience the passage of time rather than merely observing it. The poem succeeds because it invites contemplation, and every reader eventually recognizes that the future described by the teacher in this poem is also his or her own future. The closing verses of the poem return to the language of Genesis. The dust returns to the earth as it was, and the spirit returns to God who gave it. The allusion reminds us that Ecclesiastes belongs within the larger biblical story. Human beings are creatures fashioned from the dust and animated by the breath of God. Our dignity arises from a divine gift rather than from our own achievements. So the teacher has spent the entire book leading his readers back to this foundational truth. Jesus entered fully into that same condition in the incarnation, where he affirms the goodness of created life because the Son of God, God himself, assumes genuine humanity. And then he goes through the experiences like you and I would go through. He experiences fatigue and betrayal. He grieves when his friend Lazarus dies. He rejoices with his friends at a wedding where everybody's had too much wine to drink. And he celebrates the Passover meal with his disciples. The Gospels consistently portray Jesus as embracing ordinary human existence while remaining wholly faithful to the Father. His humanity gives modern Christian readers a profound way to go back and read Ecclesiastes again. The teacher teaches us to receive life gratefully because it comes from God. Jesus embodies that wisdom perfectly. So his crucifixion brings this theme to its deepest expression. Jesus entrusts his life to the Father without grasping for security on his own terms. When he's confronted by Pontius Pilate and the leaders who say, we could have you crucified if we wanted to, he says, you wouldn't have that power if my Father hadn't given it to you. He says he could call down a legion of angels, but he doesn't. His final words in Luke's Gospel, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit, reveal complete confidence in the God whom he has trusted throughout his ministry. The resurrection then becomes God's vindication of that trust. Christian faith receives Ecclesiastes with both agreement and hope, because the teacher correctly recognized that death places every human accomplishment under judgment, but then the resurrection declares that God has acted within history to overcome death. Ecclesiastes concludes with words that have generated considerable discussion. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of everyone. It feels like an add-on. It feels like it's been tacked on the end. So some scholars have regarded these verses as a later editorial addition. It's a very different tone than most of what you read in Ecclesiastes. But others maintain that they provide an appropriate conclusion to the book's argument. Whichever position you adopt, the theological connection is still strong. Reverence for God gathers together everything the teacher has learned. The fear of the Lord appears at the beginning of Israel's wisdom tradition. Proverbs presents it as the foundation upon which wisdom is built. And then Ecclesiastes arrives at the same destination after a much longer journey. The teacher has explored every avenue through which human beings seek lasting significance. He has reached for knowledge. He's experienced hard labor. He's pursued wealth and reputation. And each inquiry has revealed another aspect of human limitation. Those discoveries prepare the teacher and the reader, you and I, to understand reverence for God with greater depth than before. Humility becomes possible because the illusion of mastery has finally disappeared. This ending also illuminates the ministry of Jesus. When asked about the greatest commandment, Jesus says, the whole law is fulfilled through wholehearted love of God and genuine love for one's neighbors. His answer reflects the same vision that closes Ecclesiastes. Human flourishing grows from a rightly ordered relationship with the Creator, and every other good finds its proper place within that larger reality. Ecclesiastes has sometimes been described as the Bible's most pessimistic book, but that description misses its deepest achievement. The teacher strips away illusions because wisdom begins with truthfulness. And while human beings remain finite creatures whose lives unfold within time, they cannot compel history to serve their ambitions. They cannot preserve every good thing they love or remove death from the human condition. But we can receive each day with gratitude and honor God and discover joy in the ordinary gifts that God gives us. For Christians, the story doesn't end there. The resurrection of Jesus opens a horizon that Ecclesiastes could not even anticipate. Even so, the teacher remains an indispensable guide. He teaches us to abandon the fantasy of self-sufficiency before we can understand grace. He teaches us to receive life before we attempt to explain it. He shows us that wisdom reaches fulfillment in the reverence for God, and the gospel does not overturn those lessons. It confirms them and then carries them forward towards their completion in Jesus Christ in his death and resurrection. And that is the story of Ecclesiastes. It's a beautiful book, and it's good to read when you're depressed, and it's good to read when you're at peace and feel like you have a circumspect view of the world and of life. I really love the book of Ecclesiastes, and I'm glad that millennia ago they decided to include it in our canon and not tune this voice out. So I do encourage you to read Ecclesiastes itself, beginning to end. It's a short book, and take time to meditate on it the way the author would intend you to. God bless your reading.